Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm so glad to be able to talk to Kerry Noble. Actually, I got a hold of you through a mutual friend of ours, Casey from the Cult Vault podcast. She's the one that turned me on to you. So welcome, Kerry, to Mindshift podcast.
Thanks, Clint. Glad to be here.
And I'm sure we'll have a lot of interesting things to talk about. Of course, your basic story, which I'm sure we'll get into in more detail, was that you were, of course, a member of the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. I guess charitably, it was just a militia organization, but I'm sure we'll talk more about it. There was I guess you would say, a white supremacy, racist component to it, a Christian fundamentalist piece. So can you take us through that? The CSA, are they still around today?
Oh, no, it was totally disbanded in 86. Everybody had to leave the property by that point. So it's no more at all. There's hardly anything left on the property at all.
Right. So, yeah, the what do you want to call it, a compound or whatever it was? So take us through who started the CSA, because I know you were quite high up in it and you've got your own sort of version of what happened in the end. But who started it and what was it sort of originally about?
Jim Ellison was the founder of the group. He started the group actually around 73, 74. Mm-hmm. He had come out of San Antonio, Texas, from a place called School of the Ministries, and wanted to start an apocalyptic group out in the middle of nowhere, preparing for the last days, Jesus coming back, that kind of stuff. He wasn't predicting when, but in the meantime, he was helping kids get off drugs and get out of cults, ironically. That was in Elijah, Missouri. So he stayed there for 2 or 3 years, then moved into Arkansas, northern Arkansas, temporarily at a place called Mountain Creek Resort that had several cabins that were used for hunting. So the owner let us live there for free, in exchange for just making sure nobody broke into the property and ruined everything. Mm-hmm. I moved there in 77 while they were still at Mountain Creek. My wife and we had one child, and we're expecting our second child. In early 78, Jim bought the property from Campus Crusade for Christ, just right on the Arkansas-Missouri border, bought it from Campus Crusade, like I said, and it was 224 acres. Once we had the property, of course, we started building houses on it. In those days, it was not racist. It was not paramilitary militia. It was just a simple apocalyptic group. All of us just wanted to raise our family in the country, away from the big cities, and just figure whenever Jesus came back, we would kind of see what would happen.
You'd be ready.
That was fine for the first year. We worked together, we fellowshiped together, we worshiped together, we all had our own individual homes. We didn't live communally. But in those days, we were known as Zarephath Horeb Community Church. CSA itself had not been invented yet. In the summer of 78, we were introduced to some teachings by a man named John Todd, who was supposedly had come out of a witchcraft organization, was going around the country exposing people that were involved with religion and politics and Hollywood and that kind of stuff, that supposedly had witchcraft ties. And we were introduced to terms we were not familiar with in those days, the Illuminati, the Bilderbergers, the Council of 33, that kind of stuff.
All that conspiracy theory fodder, yeah.
Conspiracy theories, that kind of stuff. That was new for us. But one thing that John said, that, he started talking about refuges like us when everything collapses, groups were storing up food and clothing and building homes. But he said, if you hadn't thought about this, when all the everything comes down, however it's going to happen, how will you protect yourselves from all the bad guys that are also So you got to have guns.
Yeah, of course you do.
Yeah, that was a new concept for us. We just sort of assumed that whenever it came down, God would protect us somehow. But it sort of made sense to us. So over the next 18 months, we spent $52,000 on guns, ammunition, military equipment, and clothing, fatigues and stuff. So that, of course, that was a lot of money back in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And since we had the guns, we had to start training. Most of us had never been around guns all that much, except for some hunting, and that was it. So we started training. We got bigger and developed squads. We built an obstacle course in a 4-block mock town called Silhouette City. And we practiced every scenario that we could possibly think of in any kind of weather that happened. So if it rained, snowed, the heat of the summer, it didn't matter. We practiced and practiced and practiced. Eventually, we became known as the #1 civilian SWAT team in the United States. And then that was in 78, early 79. In the fall of 79, we got introduced Christian identity, what was known as the 2 line, from a preacher named Dan Gayman. Christian identity teaches that the Jews are not God's chosen people in the Bible, that the white race is. Jews are a counterfeit race that started with when Eve had sex with the devil, and later on that day had sex with Adam and produced twins that were known as Cain and Abel. And of course, Cain killed Abel, and from that point on, warfare on the earth for the control of the earth occurred. Under Christian identity teaching is still occurring today.
Is that something to do with the lost tribes of Israel allegedly fled to the British Isles? Is that part of that?
That's really more British Israelism,
right?
Which was the main teaching before Christian identity. It was very popular in the 40s and 50s, early 60s, but then in the 60s, Christian identity started really forming up and getting more popular. So by the time we were introduced to it, it had a pretty good stronghold in America. British Israel teaches that, you've got the northern kingdom with 10 tribes, which is the house of Israel. You got the 2 southern kingdoms, which went into the Babylonian captivity, which was the house of Judah. And from that, mixing in with the Babylonian religion, the Babylonian people, when they came out of Babylon, Judaism was a mixed pagan religion at that point. Christian identity takes it a step further and says, well, if you really trace all that seed back, then you'll discover that, the whole thing about Eve having sex with the devil, and regardless of whether they were known as Jews or Edomites or whatever name they were known as in a particular point in time, that seed continued and used things like parables of Jesus, specifically the wheat and the tares. That the wheat are the good seed, the tares are the bad seed, and the seed is taken as literal.
Is that the serpent seed doctrine?
Yes.
So right, the line of the serpent was that line where Satan had sex with Eve and produced that race. So the white race is therefore the uncorrupted true Israel in that sense, right? So let me get this straight. So you originally, then I'm trying to keep my head around this story. So you got into weapons first of all, just as a way to defend what you had in case the end did come, like the big collapse and all the rest of it. Then comes the Christian identity piece that's added into it. So what's the theology of the group by this point then? Where are they at? Well,
pretty much the group had become Christian identity. Most of our members, to be honest, could not have explained it if their life depended on it.
Right.
Where we led as a group, everybody just kind of followed along. I was the Bible teacher, so Christian identity took us about 6 months to sort out because Jill and I had both come from church backgrounds. So that was pretty radical for us to just start off with. Guns made sense. Christian identity at first really didn't.
Right.
But as the Bible teacher, I bought the books to study, and by the time we incorporated it into our theology, it answered probably 70 to 80% of our questions and didn't answer everything, but enough that we were able to adapt it.
Right. So you're becoming essentially what becomes a white supremacist group with a Christian sort of fundamentalist background with guns.
Yeah, fundamentalists. And then we were a charismatic group in our original days. So, we believed in speaking in tongues, miracles, healings, that kind of stuff. And so that made us really unique amongst the various groups in the country.
How many groups were there at that time that were even similar to yours? I mean, you can think of paramilitary like the KKK. I'm not sure when they started getting into paramilitary stuff, the groups up in northern Idaho and things like that back in the day. But how many groups in the late 70s were there like yours?
Very few. And when we first adapted from guns, for an example, we were known as survivalists. That was the main term back then. Being a survivalist didn't necessarily mean that you had a lot of guns. You had some guns, but you were storing up. It's what's known as the preppers.
Right. Doomsday preppers. Yeah.
So you were storing up food, ammunition, clothing, that kind of stuff, and living pretty much in the wilderness somewhere, trying to cut
off the grid.
Right, being off the grid as much as possible. Very few groups were survivalist and Christian identity. Most Christian identity groups were not paramilitary. So even when we're talking about the Klan, there's a lot of Klan groups that weren't violent, weren't other than posting flyers out in town or something like that. Like the neo-Nazis sometimes did. But nobody carried it to the extreme that we did. Prepared as much as we did, or were as serious about it as we were.
Well, how much of it was related to the American Christian Patriot movement? Because I was reading an article about the CSA on the Encyclopedia of Arkansas website, and it said that your group said the CSA was one of the many militias that supported the American Christian Patriot movement. Followers of this ideology supported hostility against any form of government above the county level, vilify Jews and non-whites as children of Satan. So there's your Satan seed, isn't it? They obsess about achieving religious and racial purification of the United States, believe in a conspiracy theory that regards Jewish leaders as controlling important financial and media positions within the U.S., and advocate the overthrow of the U.S. government. To what extent would you have said that the CSA supported any or all of those elements?
Pretty close to all of it, eventually. Now, we were introduced to the racist aspect by the Christian Patriots Defense League up in Illinois in early 79.
Right.
But the way they introduced it was strictly on the racial aspect. That was really not much of a turnoff for us. I bought some books there. Two of them I can still remember. One was called The Great Achievements of the Negro Race, and it was just blank pages.
Oh, right. Clever, very clever.
Very clever.
Forget about George Washington Carver and Frederick Douglass and so many.
Yeah, there was another book about Martin Luther King called Martin Lucifer Coon.
Wow.
So, those really didn't do a whole lot for us.
Yeah.
Later on in that year, when we met Dan Gaiman came from a patriotic point of, believing in the United States, believing in the government, believing in God's heritage for the United States and his purpose. So that was easier for us to kind of swallow.
Right.
And then once I started really studying Gaiman's teachings, he mixed a lot of scriptures, whereas at Christian Patriots Defense League, there wasn't too much on scriptures and God and that kind of stuff.
That was more the conspiracy theories.
It was mainly just being racially in your face. Are you familiar with William Potter Gale?
No, I haven't heard of him.
He was a leader of the Christian identity movement back in those days, and he was at that first meeting. And I can remember I was one of the ones who got to get up and speak to everybody at one point. He came up to me later on that day, had a cigarette in one hand, a can of beer in the other, and said, he walks up to me and says, "Boy, if you're going to talk about God, you need to use his name and not Lord. That's a pagan."
Oh, right. Okay.
Well,
in your face, huh?
Yeah, and you got a can of beer and a cigarette, so I don't put much credibility into what you're saying.
Yeah, that could do it. So what's
Yeah.
happening then? Your group's becoming more racist, more conspiracy theory driven, and you've got guns and you've got an identity movement going on. So take us through what's the next step and what happened after this?
Well, so this is around 19, of course, in those days, the big thing was the farm crisis. Farmers were losing their land. And this hadn't been too far since the 70s when R.V. Wade was first made legal. So abortion was made legal. Prayer was kicked out of school. So those were major signs to us that the end was coming. You had the farm crisis, and it looked like, the government was betraying the American people. And then in 83, after we became known as CSA, Gordon Call was a tax protester up in the Dakotas. 2 U.S. Marshals try to kill him. He shoots both of them. I think kills one is all. Might have killed both of them. I don't remember. We saw the news reports on TV. Didn't mean a whole lot to us because he's up in the Dakotas. Well, about 6 months later, he's found in northern Arkansas, which is our territory. And he's in a shootout with FBI, local sheriff. Sheriff gets killed. Gordon Call gets killed. So this was our first major martyr, where we perceived that the government had made war on the Christian patriot people. So Jim went up to Idaho to the Aryan Congress in July of 83. I think it was. Call was killed in June. So right after that, of course, that was the talk of everybody at that point. And everybody wanted to know what we were about it since it was in our backyard. So we had to decide if we were going to do something in retribution for Call or do nothing. And if we did nothing, that would kind of kick us out of the right-wing movement. So we decided to go ahead and do something. And we devised a plot to blow up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. The same federal building, of course, that Timothy McVeigh did 12 years later.
Right.
So we had our munitions guys start to build a rocket launcher, had about 12 or 16 rockets that would be bolted into the back of a van. We'd drive across the street, park, open the doors, and all these rockets would go into the building and do whatever damage it was going to do. While he was building it, one of the rockets went off in his hands accidentally. Scarred his hands pretty bad. So we took that, Jim and I took that as a sign from God that was not what we were supposed to do. That if we're going to do something, retribution to Call, it had to be something more personal towards Call. Well, some friends of ours had been arrested for harboring Call. So we decided, to make that the mission. So we devised plans to assassinate the federal judge, the main FBI agent, and the prosecuting attorney that was over the case of our friends. So we cased their homes and, made plans. And then on December 26th, we were going to leave and assassinate all three of them, which, of course, in those days, no federal judge had ever been assassinated. So it would have, hit the news.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
Yeah. And so we packed up our two vehicles on the night of December 25th. And we prayed that if this is what God wanted, let everything go smoothly. If it wasn't, stop us somewhere along the way. Well, we got up the next morning and it had snowed, and there was no forecast to snow at all.
Must be a sign from God.
Must be a sign from God.
But, shouldn't go kill these judges.
Yeah. But, we thought about it, and Jim thought about it, and the other guys all wanted to do. There were 6 of us involved with it. Myself, Jim, and one of the other elders were going to be dropped off in a nearby town as an alibi. The other 3 guys would go do the assassination. So, we decided to go ahead and do it. It was about a 4-hour, 5-hour drive over to Fort Smith. And about halfway there, we rounded a curve, and another vehicle was in our lane. And we ran head on and totaled the van that we were in. So, of course, it totaled the vehicle that ran into us also. So while everybody else was trying to, move the vehicles from the van to the other vehicle, I had to get out and see if the couple was okay. It was an elderly couple. Of course, in those days, there's no cell phones.
Yeah.
So we had to wait for somebody to drive by to, go get help. Obviously, that stopped that particular plan too.
That would do it.
That would do it. So
yeah, head-on collisions tend to ruin your plans.
that was December of '83, and we had done some other minor kind of stuff, but those were the two big plans, and we just felt like God didn't want us to go into that kind of extremism. In the meantime, of course, out of the '83 Congress, then you had the formation of the Order, which was some former Aryan Nations members and some former CSA members. So they did start doing some serious stuff, counterfeiting. They robbed armored cars, killed the Jewish talk show host Alan Berg. So they got a lot of notoriety, and the heat was on them. And then in '84, some of the Order started getting busted, and we figured, well, it was just a matter of time. In the late spring, early summer of '84, Ellison and I were disagreeing about the course of the group. Where was God really leading us? Where should we go? And I wanted to go back to how it was when I first came there. Jim did not. He wanted to go on and build a bigger and better army, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And we got into some heated arguments, and it pretty much split our friendship to the point to where in June, I finally just broke and said, okay, if you want it to start, I'll start this so-called Second American Revolution and the race war and all that kind of stuff. I devised a plan. There was a park up in Kansas City, Missouri that became known as a gay park. That supposedly on Saturday nights there was a lot of traffic out in this park. So I said, have our munitions guy get me a silenced weapon. I'm going to take one of the guys with us that was raised in Kansas City because I'd never even been there. Most of us knew how to drive around, but he did. And then also get me a briefcase, a bomb briefcase full of C4. And I'll use the silenced weapon to kill any gays in the park. And then we'll go find an adult bookstore and I'll blow up the bookstore. Because these were two symbols of what everybody in the right wing stood against, homosexuality and pornography, right? So Jim had the munitions guy prepare it. My friend and I left late Saturday, drove to Kansas City, which was about 4 hours away. Got to the park around 11 o'clock at night, drove around, 10, 12 times and saw absolutely nobody.
Nobody in the place.
Nobody.
How ironic.
And, he was driving. I was, the passenger seat, and I had my window down, had the silenced weapon. If I'd seen anybody, I was going to assume they were gay and just pop them, right? And nobody was there. So I said, well, let's go find an adult bookstore, see if maybe that's what we should do. So we found a pretty good sized adult bookstore eventually. And I told him to stay in the car. I'll take the bomb in. So I walked in with this briefcase. And the clerk says, well, come on in, but you can't take your briefcase in. Well, then obviously it hit me. Of course you can't take a briefcase in. They'll think you're going to steal or shoplift, dirty magazines, videos.
Yep, everything.
Yeah, that even crossed my mind. So, I couldn't very much leave it with him, go to the back. I didn't know what to do. So I said, I'll go take it back to the car and I'll come back. So I went back out to the car and told my friend what had happened. So honestly, we didn't know what to do. So it's too late to go back to the farm. So I said, let's just spend the night. Maybe God will show us tomorrow what we're supposed to do. So we got up the next morning and we didn't have a clue. So he said, well, let's drive over to my church. I'll show you where I grew up here and what church I went to. I said, okay, that'd be interesting. So we went over there. As soon as we drove up, I said, are you sure this is it? He said, yeah. I said, well, I hate to tell you this, but it's not your church no more. It's the Metropolitan Community Church, which, of course, was the gay.
Yeah, it's an affirming church. Yeah.
And, of course, he got pretty angry with that. I said, maybe this is what we're supposed to do.
Right. What have they done to my church?
Yeah. So we walk in. Of course, they're assuming we're just two homosexuals walking in, had a briefcase. And, of course, we stereotype-wise, we're thinking there's this sexual orgy going on in this church. Of course, we go in there and there's not,
Yeah, they're having a service.
Yeah. Now the guys are sitting on one side of in the pews. The girls are sitting on the other side of the pews. So I had told my friend, we got to stick around for half an hour. We just can't sit down, trip the.
Yeah, leave a briefcase. Don't mind this. Yeah. Pay no attention to this briefcase. We're just going to leave now after 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Not suspicious at all.
Yeah. So we stuck around. And of course, the service starts. The pastor comes out, talks about his sexual relationship with the music director, who's male also. And so we figure, well, this is it. This is what we're supposed to do. And, we stuck around for the announcements, all that kind of stuff. Well, one thing, obviously, that you're not supposed to do in a military situation is put a face on the enemy, which is difficult to do if you're sitting in the midst of the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So I started looking around and realized that these people don't look any different than I do. If I saw them on the street, I wouldn't know they were gay. I wouldn't think nothing about it. They're dressed like I am. They're dressed normally. They look normal, that kind of stuff. And then I started thinking about, well, none of these people have ever hurt me, my family, friends, nothing like that.
Mm-hmm. What have they ever done to me?
Yeah, what have they ever done to me?
Perfect strangers to you, yeah.
And here I am contemplating killing 60, 70 people, right? Well, then I went from that to the next step was, is this really going to accomplish what I have been programmed to think that it's going to accomplish, this uprising?
Mm-hmm.
We had contacted various groups and said, hey, there's going to be something happen on the news. You'll know it when you see it, and it's a sign to rise up. So I thought, well, is that really what's going to happen, or is what's going to happen is I do this and I either die in a shootout or spend the rest of my life in prison or on death row? And none of those were appealing to me.
Mm.
And so I was pretty much talking myself out of this. Well, then the next thing that happened was the final step, and the music started. And then I saw these people doing what we did in our church services, lift their heads up, put their hands up, and just start worshiping God. And that changed everything for me. I realized instantly that these people were no different than me. They're trying to find their place in God, like I'm still trying to find my place in God with all the quarreling Jim and I had been doing over the last year. For the first time, I didn't see them as homosexuals. I saw them just as Christians, and I couldn't kill Christians.
Fellow Christians, yeah.
Yeah, so that was about half an hour that we were there. So I picked up the briefcase, told my friend to come on, we're leaving. So we get out to the car. I explained to him everything, and he said, oh, good, because I really didn't think we were supposed to do it either.
All right. I was thinking the same thing. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to be the first one.
Yeah. So we decided, we're just going to go back to the farm. Of course, we got there, Ellison and all the guys were around the TV waiting for some sort of a news event.
Something big's going to happen.
Yeah. And we walk in. He says, what's going on? What happened? I explained everything to him, and he looked at me in front of all the men and said, you're nothing but a coward. Yeah. And he said, I washed my hands of you. And I feel totally out of his grace.
Right. That was the end for him. Yeah, for you and him.
Yeah.
When we get back in just a few minutes in the second half of this chat with Kerry, we're going to find out what happened next. There's actually a lot more to the story, and there's a lot more to this episode as well. We want to get into the sort of cult psychology behind this group, and I want to ask Kerry, what keeps people in cults? What keeps people in right-wing, alt-right type groups that we're seeing more and more of now? And in fact, we've seen this even in the Obama era. In fact, I saw a statistic once that during the Obama administration, white militant groups just shot up by, like tenfold. So, and in the Trump administration, of course, now we're seeing the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. We saw a lot of that in the January 6th insurrection. So I want to get Kerry's unique perspective as a member of a former white supremacist group. What keeps people in those kind of groups? what attracts them. How do you get someone out of a movement like that? Is it possible? It's very similar, if not the same, as a cult dynamic. We're going to talk about his activism. And then at the very end of the show, I want to talk to him about Christian nationalism, because this is something that Kerry is seeing a lot of overlap with far-right or alt-right groups getting increasingly in bed with Christian nationalism. In fact, just the other day, as I'm doing this recording now, there was a big flap up in Bonners Ferry, Idaho. Now, I've mentioned before, I've been doing a lot of research on Doug Wilson. He runs Christ Church out of Moscow, Idaho. Well, there was a news story on CNN that came out just the other day about Bonners Ferry, Idaho, which is a little town, and there was this big furor about potential book banning in a public library. And I started looking into who are some of the groups behind this. And among others, there's a group called Moms for Liberty, which has some real deep sort of mega pocket donors, mega donors on the Republican side. That's one concern. But then there's a church up there, a Lordship church. And I started looking into this church, and these guys are pushing this American redoubt mythology. They're going to break away from the United States. They're going to have their own sort of country up there in the Palouse region, the northwest of Idaho, Washington State, Montana, up in that region. And these guys are preaching like a message of hate. And these guys are behind the effort to ban books, anything that in their view promotes LGBTQ values, critical race theory, any sort of black voices. They wanted to ban a book about Frederick Douglass, of all people. So this is where this is going. And this is a danger. This is a concern. And we're seeing these guys are serious, like survivalists. The pastor of this church up there in Bonners Ferry, he runs an Army-Navy surplus store. On their church website, there's a link to a survivalist store where you can buy guns and all sorts of, doomsday prepper stuff. These guys are serious, hardcore survivalists. They want to break away. So these are the kind of people we're talking about, and that was in the orbit of groups that Kerry was running with. So this is a real concern going forward. Now, I wanted to mention, before we go back to the second half, I wanted to talk about what's coming up here in the next few weeks on Mindshift Podcast. I had a conversation the other day with a good friend of mine, Dr. David DeAndre. He's an expat like me. He's living out of Canada, and he's got a new book out called Tulip, The Poisonous Flower of Calvinism. And so we had a really good conversation, kind of took a deep dive into the backstory of Calvinism, the history of Calvin a little bit, and why exactly he would say that as a doctrine, as a theology, why is Calvinism in a way a poisonous flower, playing off that tulip sort of acronym. So that's coming up here in the next episode. And then I've got a chat scheduled with my good friend, a returning guest, Andrew Gurovich. We're going to be talking about how the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, how did that book impact on our deconstruction? And there's some really interesting stuff because, of course, I did my doctoral studies on the book of Ezekiel. And so I've got a lot to say about that book. It actually, ironically, in a weird way, helped me to deconstruct my views of God. So I think that is going to be a really fascinating episode. I'm so looking forward to reconnecting with my good friend Andrew again. Oh, and before I forget, I've got something else that's really, really cool, really exciting. I've got an interview booked next week with Dave Warnock. I had him on the show before talking about his work with Dying Out Loud. He's got a new book out called Childish Things, and it's a fantastic book. In fact, I would recommend getting the Audible version if you can, because Dave actually narrates the book, and it's his long journey out of evangelicalism, out of being a pastor, and becoming an atheist. And I won't tell you anymore. I don't want to spoil it, but that is a fantastic book. If, like me, you grew up in the church in the 70s, 80s, 90s, if you were a part of that movement and then deconstructed and got out. And Dave's story is incredibly personal, so I'm really looking forward to talking to Dave Warnock next week. So that's coming up too. Look for that episode. And then we've got our first Mindshift Zoom call coming up in the month of September here. In just a few weeks, we've got Luna Corbden, who was my guest just on the last episode of the show. And they're going to be coming back on the 25th of September. We're going to be doing that call at 8 o'clock, and you can access that by being a Patreon supporter of the show. And in fact, speaking of Patreon supporters, I've got a new Patreon supporter. Thank you to Johannes Kucher. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's from Germany. He contacted me a while ago, said he'd been listening to the show for a long time, and it greatly helped him, so he wanted to support the show. So he's been added to our Closed Mind Shift Podcast Facebook group. So really cool to see people from around the world being impacted by the work I do. So if it helps you, consider supporting the show on Patreon and joining our Closed Mind Shift Podcast Facebook group. All right, let's get on back into the second half of this conversation with Kerry Noble. Exactly how this Covenant Sword and Arm of the Lord group really devolved into a cult group, how to get people out, and what is it all about. Let's go on into the second half of this chat.
So I decided I just didn't want to stay there. It wasn't the same place it was when I first moved there. So I left, Jim's house, and I just said, Lord, I want to leave. And the Lord just spoke to me very clearly and said, you cannot leave. You're not allowed to. And I just started bawling. I said, I'm tired. I am so tired. I just want to take my family, go back to Texas or somewhere and start all over. No, you can't. You got to stay. And so for the next several months, I'd prayed several times and always got the same answer. I got to stick around. So by the end of 84, of course, the order starts getting busted. CSA members, former members were getting busted. So we knew it was just a matter of time for people started turning state's evidence. In late summer of 84, an Arkansas State police officer, a sergeant, and an ATF agent were at a press conference that I was holding and talked to me after the press conference and introduced themselves and said, if you just ever need somebody to talk to, we're here if you just want to talk. So, okay. So in February of 85, we all pretty much knew everything was coming down pretty soon. We started seeing a lot of black SUVs in town of 4,000 people.
Kind of sticks out.
Yeah, sticks out like it sticks up.
So they're watching you now by this point.
Yeah.
The net's closing in.
Yeah. So a lot of stuff's happening across the country. So we knew it was just a matter of time. So I went to the Arkansas State police officer and I said in February, and I said, look, if a warrant ever comes down for Jim's arrest, come tell me first. Don't let the federal government come in and force. Otherwise, you'll have a shootout you can't even begin to imagine. You know as well as I do that we've been training for years and years. He said, well, as far as I know, there's not one, but if one ever does come down and I find out about it, I'll come see you first. So April 17th, 18th, he came down and said, yeah, I got an arrest warrant. Go talk to Jim, see if he'll surrender. So I went and talked to Jim. Jim said, nope, not going to surrender.
No chance, huh?
No chance right now. I'm going to pray about it tonight and see what God wants me to do. Now, we were harboring 4 members of the order at that particular time. So, it was pretty tense on our property. So I went back to the officer and I said, no, he wants to pray about it. Come back tomorrow. He said, well, okay. So he came back at 8 o'clock the next morning and Jim still would not surrender. And Gene Irby was his name. And Gene said, Kerry, this is serious. I said, believe me, Gene, I know how serious this is. I said, so what's going to happen now? Well, by mid-afternoon, the FBI is going to have roadblocks. There's only 2 roads out from our property. And he said, both those roads are going to be blocked off. You won't be able to leave. Nobody can come in, and we're going to be at a standstill. So Jim sent 6 of us into town real fast after Gene left to get some supplies. Came back around noon. They had already set up the roadblocks, so they wouldn't let any of us back in. So I talked to the FBI and I said, look, if I don't get back in, you are going to have to figure that you're going to have a shootout on your hands. I'm the only one that can talk to Ellis and see if I can persuade him to surrender. If I'm not there, there's no way he's going to surrender. And they all talked about it. And I said, okay, you can go back in, but the other 5 guys can't. So I get to go back in. So the next day, I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, was told that there were snipers around the property about every 10 yards. And Ellison wanted to see me. So I dressed in civilian, civvies rather than camouflage, and went and saw him. And Jim said, well, go out there and see what they want. I said, well, what they want's you.
Not rocket science. They want you to surrender.
They got a arrest warrant for you, buddy. So I had to go out there and, my arms are up in the air. I didn't know if I made a wrong move, I'm going to get riddled with bullets.
Yeah.
I saw one of the snipers started heading towards him. Got fairly close. He yelled out, "Stop." I said, "What are y'all doing? Are you trying to start a war?" And he's on his headphones. He said, "Are you willing to go down and talk to our commander?" "Sure." And he said, "Go down the hill to the place y'all call the Valley, which was my settlement. He'll meet you down there." I said, "Okay." It was about a quarter mile away. So again, I'm walking downhill quarter mile and I can see cops all around me.
Right. Everywhere.
Yeah. And again, not knowing if I make the wrong move, I'm dead as a doorknob. And I get down there, this guy comes up, introduces himself to me, and he's the tactical leader of the hostage rescue team out of Quantico for the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
He's the tactical leader, and for our situation, he was also the negotiator, named was Danny Colson. And I ended up liking Danny just right off the bat, just something about him. So we start talking. He said, "Look, I want you to listen to me clearly." I said, "Okay." He said, "We will not fire the first shot. We will wait this out as long as we have to. But we are going to arrest Jim Ellison." I said, "Well, okay." He said, "But if y'all fire the first shot, here's what's going to happen. I've got a 50 caliber machine gun on the hill where y'all burn your trash. And it's aimed right at you. And I've got a Huey helicopter over the hill that's got a 50 caliber on it. The first shot is going to start flying and it's going to start knocking holes into your walls, just like the other one does. And everybody's going to start shooting." There was 300 federal, state, and local law enforcement on this. He said, "Within 30 seconds, every man, woman, and child in your compound will be dead." And I just went, wow.
Yeah, some overwhelming firepower for sure.
And he said, "You need to take this as a compliment because they only send us into the most dangerous situations. And you guys have got the reputation." He said, "But this is not what we want. We want a peaceful resolution." I said, "Believe me, I want a peaceful resolution too. I do not want my friends and my family or me dying in a shootout." So we had a 4-day armed standoff. Eventually, I was able to talk Ellison into surrendering. He surrendered and we had a peaceful surrender. Nobody got killed.
Yeah, because was that before the Waco incident or after?
No, that was 8 years before.
Right. So you were a forerunner to what ended up happening. We didn't want to have happen at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco.
Yeah, because it was interesting. Our siege started on April 19th.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the Branch Davidian fire was on April 19th. Oklahoma City bombing was on April 19th.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, Patriots Day is April 19th when the Revolutionary War started. So
major date. So was that then the end of the CSA? They arrested Jim Ellison. Does everything just go away at that point and it's all over? What happened then?
Ellison got arrested, of course. They searched the property for 4 days after that. I was allowed to be there while the search was going on. And honestly, Clint, I was very impressed with how the agents handled themselves during the siege and the search of the property also. Because, again, we had several times of them tearing up the place. They handled themselves professionally. They tore up as little as possible. And I always said after it was all over, the feds left the place in better condition than after 4 days than it was when they first got it.
Put it all back and better than what it was.
Yeah, they fed the animals. They did all kinds of stuff.
But from what I've seen, they found some serious weapons because it wasn't just weapons too. It was like you had poison and things like that on the compound with this. It was like a plot to poison.
30-gallon barrel of cyanide. We had C4. We had a wall rocket. We had silencers, hand grenades.
Some serious gear.
Yeah, and of course, we've been building all this stuff for quite a number of years.
Right. What was the plan for all that hardware? I mean, obviously, on one level, you're going to defend the compound, which you talked about before, but at some level now you're actually planning attacks on the U.S. government or gay churches or whatever it might be.
Or whatever. The cyanide, we had planned to put that into a water system in a major city, believing in those days that it would kill a lot of people. Of course, I found out years later, the worst that it would have done would be make a few people sick because it would become so diluted in the water system. So, we didn't know what we were doing on some of that kind of stuff. We had a boatload of C4. We knew what to do with that. Dynamite. Now, our dynamite, we'd had it so long that it was becoming unstable. So the government blew all of it up in this huge water tank, that you see sometimes in the movies and stuff. So 4 days they're throwing this stuff in, blasting camp and everything. And it's just boom, boom.
Must have been a hell of an explosion.
Yeah.
But from what I understand, you ended up serving some time in prison with your connections to the CSA.
Yeah.
So how did that come about?
5 weeks after Ellison got arrested, anybody who had any kind of leadership role got arrested. So there were 5 of us that got arrested on May 31st. I went to the county jail where Jim was. That was part of the surrender agreement that if I got arrested, I'd be put in the same cell with Jim. And they did that. So Jim was in isolation. They put me in there with him. Here was the interesting thing. I get in there, Jim doesn't even say, how have you been? What's going on? How's the family? How's everybody? That kind of stuff. He doesn't ask any questions. Just says, look, I'm turning state's evidence for the government against all the leaders of the right-wing movement. And I said, what?
Wow. It's a quick flip.
I've prepared a list of people I've met, dates and all that kind of stuff that they can use as evidence. He said, you were right about the right-wing movement and I was wrong. So I think that God wants me to, help the government destroy the right wing. And I was speechless.
That's shocking. So he's going to sing like a canary. Just 5 minutes after he gets in prison.
He had planned this for a long time. He's been in jail 40 days.
Right. Yeah.
And it probably at least half of that time he's been talking to the government. He said, your memory's always been better than mine. Look at this list and see if I need to fix anything. Well, half the list was just a bunch of lies.
Right.
And the other half, I said, Jim, half of this stuff is just stuff you told me about. I wasn't even there for so much of this. He said, yeah, but just try to remember stuff I told you in days, things, stuff. And I don't know if you remember, there was this Pope in the 80s, I think it was, that had only been in office for like a month and died. And there was a lot of suspicion about how he died. Was he murdered? That kind of stuff. Ellison even had that Pope's name on this list, and that we were on the fringes of whoever assassinated.
You were somehow connected to that, even.
I mean, it was so
all the way to the Vatican.
Yeah, so far out of left field.
You got your fingers in a lot of pies, man. I tell you.
But it woke me up to the reality of who this man was, and what he had become, and that he was just a coward.
Yeah, he was going to flip that quick.
So shortly thereafter, he went to trial for RICO, racketeering charges. Was found guilty, and got 20 years. He was still facing weapons charges, and most of us were facing weapons charges. The other 5 guys. The government talked to me and said, if you'll turn state's evidence against Jim, you won't even go to jail. So I said, not a chance in the world will I betray this man. Not because he probably doesn't deserve it, but he did for me, more for me than any man on this planet. He taught me how to work hard. We cut cedar in those days. He taught me how to work hard. He gave me a chance to, teach him Bible, which was what I wanted to do. That was my calling. I will not betray him, even if it means me going to jail. And they said, okay, that's fine. If you'll go ahead and take a plea bargain, we'll drop it. I had 21 charges against me for guns. They said, if you'll just plea bargain down to a conspiracy to possess unlawful and unregistered weapons, you'll be facing a 5 years maximum, and we won't argue against parole, but you'll have to move to Texas. can I stay in Arkansas? You won't have to testify against Ellison. I said, I'll do that.
Yeah, that I can do.
I'll take 5 years. I knew if I went to court on this, to trial, I'd get 10 years for the weapons. That was the max. And 5 years was half of that. So I said, sure, especially if you're not going to not argue against parole or probation. I mean, so I said, I'll take that. So I went back and told Jim, I'm going to take a plea bargain. Calls me a coward again. Said, no, you got to go to trial. I'm not going to go to trial. I said, you got 20 years. You went to trial.
Yeah. Try that on.
I'm telling you, they're out to kick our hindies, you know. I said, you and the other guys, y'all can do what you want, but I'm not going to go to trial. The other guys, you know, I talked with some of them. I said, y'all do what you want to do. This is what I'm going to do. Well, then a few days later, Ellison and I are in the exercise room in the county jail, which, you know, it's a padded room size of 3 or 4 jail cells, you know, that you just walk around. And there's a window that's kind of opaque glass, you know, you can't see out of it unless lighting. So we're in there, and he said, I want you to do something for me. I said, okay. I want you to tell the government that you were the power behind the throne, that you were blackmailing me. You had something on me. We'll figure out what later. But everything that we did was your idea. I said, no, thank you.
No chance.
I said, first of all, they would never, ever believe it. I said, second of all, I'm not going to do it. You know, you chose the direction of the group. You know, you just need to handle this on your own. And he just looked at me and said, so you're going to betray me? I started crying, and I just, in my mind, I'm going, betray you? I could send you to life, you know, the rest of your life if I testified against you, which is what they wanted me to do. You know, you would never see the light of day out of prison again. You know, I'm not betraying you. You're betraying me, and you're betraying everybody else at the farm, you know, by your actions. But I didn't say it, you know, it's just what I thought. So basically, Jim and the other guys, they decided to go ahead and plead down to the conspiracy thing also, because Jim was already facing 20 years. He pled down, and they just ran his concurrent. The other guys, I ended up getting a 5-year sentence. The other guys one guy got 6 months. I think the other 3 guys got probation, 2-year probation, that kind of, because they were minor leadership.
Right. So it wasn't as bad as you initially thought. So how did you end up getting out of that thing? Because as you're describing the whole journey, it strikes me that there's a lot of parallels to cult psychology. We haven't used that word yet, but I mean, you're describing a classic, you know, compound. You've got a charismatic leader. You've got a group of dedicated followers. You've got an ideology. It's certainly an us versus them mentality. You know, and you just start going down the line. You could have ended up as a Branch Davidian or a Jim Jones, Jonestown kind of situation.
Yes.
Is that what ended up getting you out in the end? Was kind of seeing the light in the whole thing?
Here's what happened. Of course, I didn't realize until after everything was over with, and I had time to think in prison, reflect, and that kind of stuff. I believe that we became a destructive cult in the fall of '79. Once we adapted, you know, the paramilitary was strong. Once we adapted Christian identity, something happened to Jim in the fall of '79. At that point, the paramilitary leader that we had, they just went off the radar. It had quickly become something that I did not move there for by the fall of '79. But I love the place. I love the people. I love community. Community for me was everything.
Yeah, and we need community.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really do.
So there was so much I loved in spite of what I didn't like, right? Well, what happened for me, after CSA was formed in January of '81, we took on that name. We started putting out a pamphlet called the CSA Journal, 24 pages, you know, book, 8.5 folded in half, that kind of thing. We had 2,000 people on our mailing list. So I put this thing together every month. We had Christian stuff, writings in there that I did. We had military fieldcraft stuff in there. I had articles from other sources that we got was in there. So it was a hodgepodge of different kind of stuff in there. Well, one of the things I put in there, I had gotten an article from some right-wing group, I can't even remember now, that said even doctors know that there's difference between the races because doctors won't give a transfusion from a black guy to a white guy, which of course is not true. But in those days, I didn't know that wasn't true.
You didn't have the internet to, couldn't fact check.
You know, our local library wouldn't have carried anything that told me otherwise. So I just accepted it as true. So I put that in the journal, and it wasn't 2 weeks. I got a wad of papers like this from a doctor, and I had no idea how he got the journal, but he sent me all kinds of material that showed that was not true.
Right, just debunked the whole thing.
Well, I started reading it, and I went, "Uh-oh, I know where this is going." So I had to fold it all up, put it away, because I knew I'd be responsible for it if I read it anymore. But it put this doubt.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
So then I started, of course, thinking, well, if I've been lied to about this, what else have I been lied to?
Right.
The big turning point for me in March of 83. So I'm the Bible teacher. So I'm going to teach a class on the apocalypse, what could happen, as laid out in the scriptures. Of course, Matthew 24 is the groundwork for any kind of apocalyptic discussion in the scriptures. So I'm doing my Bible study on Matthew 24, and there's a scripture I had read, I don't know how many times, that all of a sudden jumped out to me in a sort of a different point of view. And the scripture says that except those days be shortened, even the very elect could be deceived. And it hit me, how in the world can God's elect be deceived during the end times? All of a sudden that didn't make sense to me. So I took it a step further, and the thought came to me that you're not deceived by anything that's the opposite. Like you cannot be deceived by a $3 bill, because there's no such thing. You can be deceived by a counterfeit $20, right? So then I thought, well, the only way that the elect could maybe be deceived by what was going on in the last days is if the last days looked like the kingdom of God, as opposed to the kingdom of the devil, the Antichrist, like we had always been taught, right? Because we had always been taught in the churches, and our theology was that in the last days was going to be the worst that man could do on the earth. All of a sudden, I turned that around and said, what if the last days could be the best that man could do, but it still fell short of the glory of God, kind of thing. And that made sense to me all of a sudden. Well, then the next logical conclusion for me was, and if that's true, then everything I've been taught about the nature of man can't be true. It's the opposite.
Now you got to question that. All the dominoes start to fall. The house of cards comes tumbling down.
Of course, we were taught that man was basically evil and sinful, and were it not for the grace of God, would manifest the very works of the devil, right? Now I believed that man is basically good and divine, and were it not for the weakness of the flesh, would manifest the kingdom of God by nature. Well, that's a total 180 degrees from everything I had been taught and everything I had believed up to this point. So I went and talked to Ellison about it. Of course, Ellison blew a cap and said, no, that's not true. You're just trying to find a way out because you're afraid.
Right. You're questioning too much now.
So I wasn't strong enough to fight him at that particular point, but I couldn't get rid of this feeling. So when the siege happened, what was important for me was the siege had to prove that I was right. If the government acted honorably during the siege, it was a step of me knowing that I was right in what I had believed for 2 years now. And of course, the government went way beyond my expectations.
You said they acted really professionally and honorably.
Very professional. I mean, even from the first time I met Colson all the way until they finished the search, everything was handled correctly. They did very well. I had
Right.
no qualms with what the government did after that. The government could have made it so much worse on us. There was
Oh,
so
yeah.
many things they could have charged us with that they didn't charge us. They just wanted our group to be gone. And they wanted Ellison more than they wanted anybody else.
Yeah, they didn't want a firefight and everything else. So that cognitive dissonance finally caught up to you. Well, I know we got a little bit of time left, but I'm interested to find out. We were talking earlier about you guys were the CSA was one of the forerunners of some of these modern day militia groups. And of course, we've seen more and more of that, especially during the Obama presidency. There was just this explosion of right wing, militia groups and all the rest of it. And just recently, as we're doing this recording, just a few weeks ago, there was a big arrest up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the Patriot Front. And I know you've been following that story. What can you tell us about, as you see it now, your perspective, 20, 30 years later, what is your take on these modern day sort of far right militia groups, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, those kind of things, the Patriot Front, Christian nationalism combined with this militia movement?
Well, once I got out of prison, of course, I had a 5-year sentence, so I couldn't speak out while I was still on parole, right? I finished my sentence at the end of July in 1990. So I was able to start speaking out against hate and violence and started doing that almost immediately. Started speaking at terrorism conferences and law enforcement conferences and that kind of stuff. One thing I always told them even way back then, it doesn't really matter what you call yourself as a group. And of course, now with the internet, you have a website that calls themselves, the monster militia from hell or whatever. And it could be two guys, you don't know, it could be two teenagers in mom's basement or whatever. So I've never cared what they call themselves. Usually, that's symbolic of something, but it doesn't necessarily mean something. Sometimes it can define their belief system, like especially if they're a Klan group or a neo-Nazi group. Militia will define itself to certain degrees. So the specifics of any one group isn't really what I look for. What I look for is a particular ideology. And in the ideology, for example, with the Proud Boys or any of those guys, being more militia or what was known in our days as constitutionalist. Most of them, like our group, if you took those guys separate, and let's say there's 100 Proud Boys as an example. If you took those 100 guys and talked to them individually, 99 out of 100 could not explain to you their purpose, their mission, their goals, how they envision the future, none of that kind of stuff. But they're going on by rhetoric. They'll spout the rhetoric, they'll mouth the talk, but they don't necessarily understand what they're doing.
Right. It's not total buy-in. Yeah.
All they're doing in their mind is they see a problem, they think they're the answer. Right? And that's typical. So, you look at them, January 6th as an example, like we talked about earlier, most of those people had no clue what they were really doing there.
Mm-hmm.
None of them, I would bet, had any plan for after they attacked the Capitol. Are we going to hang Mike Pence? Are we going to take Nancy Pelosi, go hang her? What kind of government are we going to form afterward? They never thought about that kind of stuff, right? In a mob mentality, you don't think. Just like in the cult mentality, there's a certain point where you don't think logically any longer. You're just going with the flow of the group. So once it all started happening at the Capitol, most of the people were just, the fervor was up, the adrenaline's going, somebody starts running towards the Capitol. So now everybody.
Let's keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe this is the Second American Revolution.
Maybe this is it.
Yeah.
This is the storm finally.
They hope so, but they don't know. So of course we know what happens, and as soon as it all settled down and people started getting arrested, I told other reporters and podcasts, it's not going to be a matter hardly any time at all. People are going to start turning evidence, bleeding out. Always happens, always. because then they start realizing what reality is all about. It's easy to romanticize revolution. It's a whole different ballgame when you're going to really try to do it. Crossing the line for domestic terrorism is not easy at all.
Yeah. As you've testified, you couldn't do it yourself.
I couldn't do it. I'm closer than almost anybody.
Yeah. You went way further than most people will ever do.
And I'm fortunate because, I had a core in me that was against all this kind of stuff. My mother didn't raise me to be a fool kind of thing. But society doesn't realize that people don't get into the movement in order to cause problems or to destroy buildings or kill people. They get into it because they think it will solve some aspect of their life that they're not happy with, their own problems. So they get into some sort of a community like we did, thinking that community is going to help take care of them. And then they realize eventually they're in over their heads, just like most of us realize we're in over our heads, and what do? Ellison had a saying he said a lot, and it was, there's no easy way to get off the Bronx Bull once you're on it.
That's certainly true.
Yes, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Better hang on for dear life, man. Ride this thing to the bitter end.
There were times I think that Ellison hoped or wished that we had taken a different road, but he didn't know how to get off that road and get back to how we were. We had gone too far. And for most people that get mixed up in right-wing groups and extremism especially, what am I going to do? If I leave the group, am I leaving God? Am I betraying somebody? Am I betraying myself? Can I ever live with myself? You have to battle all of those questions.
All the doubts.
If you can't come to an answer that you can live with, then you're stuck. You're going to stay in that group.
And that's the cult dynamics again, isn't it?
And if you stay in the group, I used to tell, when I used to talk to a lot of people in the right wing, I'd say, if you stay in the group, you stay in the movement, one of two things are going to happen. You're either going to die in some sort of a shootout or something, or you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. You're going to go to prison, and there's no other option, because if you ever want to get out, as was seen with the order, especially members who tried to get out were killed.
Yeah, it was serious business.
Happens with bikers. It happens with urban gangs. You try to get out, you put your life on the line.
Yeah, you don't quit the Hells Angels. You don't just walk away.
Say, well, it's been fun. Talk to y'all later.
Not that easy.
So that leaves you in a corner.
Right.
What am I going to do? I can't.
Trapped.
You're trapped.
So that's an interesting perspective. So how do you, let's say you have someone, a family member, relative, loved one, someone like that who does get involved in the far right, militia movement or serious conspiracy theory stuff. Is there any tips you can give us that would help us to get them out? How do you reach that person, or can you reach that person?
You can reach them if you can talk to them one-on-one. Of course, if they're still with their group or got their buddies around, that makes it really difficult.
Sure.
But if you can get a one-on-one, here's what I've done in the past. Is what gets you into the movement typically is a recruiter. Recruiter says, what's going on in your life. The recruiter doesn't care what's going on in your life. That's just a lead-in question.
That's the hook.
Well, yes, the hook. Well, I'm having trouble with my wife. I lost my job. I can't pay my bills. My house is getting foreclosed on. It doesn't matter what it is. But as the recruiter, I want to find out what your hot button is. What's bothering you in life?
Right. What's your vulnerability?
Yeah. So, and once I understand that, then I can point you to whose fault it is, because it's not your fault.
Oh, no.
You're the victim.
You're the victim here, man.
You lost your job. Oh, yeah. The government is bringing in, shipping jobs overseas to Asia.
All the immigrants or whatever. Yeah. It could be anything.
Urban renewal. You got to, you got to let blacks have a chance at the jobs, even if they're less qualified than the whites are. So whatever.
Anything.
Yeah. You just go with that and they go, oh, yeah, no wonder their life isn't treating me good. It's their fault. It's their fault. And you keep reinforcing that to them. So now you turn it around. The guy is no longer happy with the group he wants out. So you do the same thing. I talk to you individually. So you got involved with the group because you had a problem in your life. I'm assuming, yeah. What was it? And he'll tell me. So you got involved with the group to help you with such and such a problem. Did it help? No, didn't help.
Right.
Are you happier now? No, I'm scared for my life.
Yeah, I'm way worse off. Yeah.
I'm way worse off. So what are we going to do? How can we get you out of this? Do you have anywhere to go? Do you have support of your family? Is there friends that you can go to with you by yourself? With your, if you got a family, will your family leave with you? So you got to find out those kinds of questions. And let's say the guy is able to get out, and go somewhere. He says, "Oh, but I'm scared for my life." But I just tell him, "You're scared for nothing. Believe me, the chances that somebody's going to come after you, especially if you leave the area, is so slim. It's never going to happen." And I'll use myself as an example. Look, I ended up leaving the group. I left the movement. I had to testify in a trial against the right-wing leaders on the sedition trial of '88. My life is never in danger.
They haven't come after you yet.
Yeah, they've never
haven't made a move on you yet.
Yeah, all of that is to make you afraid, and
it works. Yeah, it's a classic cult tactic, isn't it? The fear of leaving. If you leave the group, then there will be consequences, whatever that might be, whether it's eternal damnation or someone's going to come after you. There's the fear of being shunned or whatever it is.
Somebody has planted those seeds in your mind, and to you, that's reality.
Yeah.
So you got to tear that reality down and you say, look, nobody came after me. Nobody's come after any of my friends, other people who have left. And when I first came out, there was only 4 or 5 of us in the country who had left the right-wing movement. Nobody of those 4 or 5 was ever threatened. Right now, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people have left groups, and I would dare say probably none of them ever got killed. That left. It's just the groups have got their own issues, their own problems to deal with. As long as you're not staying in that area where they still have contact with you, you're pretty much clean to go.
Yeah, you don't want to stay in that area. Yeah. Well, I've got one more question for you. Now, this is kind of a different subject, but I did an episode a while ago talking about when it was the Roe versus Wade, the leak that came out on the Supreme Court. So this is the whole thing about, I thought about what would life be like in a theocratic kingdom. And I went through and talked about different historical examples, Calvin's Geneva, Cromwell's England, and so forth. Now, I ended that episode by quoting your Facebook page, quite a lengthy quote where you talked about if they overturn Roe versus Wade, which is going to happen, it looks like, that's just the slippery slope. That's the first stepping stone to taking away a number of rights of people, not just in America, but it may be a model for what happens in other countries as well. What's your concern with that in terms of what you see happening with the Supreme Court and Roe versus Wade?
Well, my concern, of course, with Christian nationalism is the whole fuel of this thing. People don't understand the danger of Christian nationalism. It sounds like a good idea if you're a Christian.
Sure.
If you're a white person, it sounds like a good idea.
Even better.
Now, if you're a white Christian, it really sounds like a great idea.
It's going to tick all the boxes.
Yeah. Let's just get rid of all, abortion. Let's get rid of all the things that God
same-sex marriage.
Same-sex marriage, everything that God would judge America for, because we want God to bless America like he used to.
It all sounds so good.
Sounds so good. But here's what people don't realize. It starts with R.V. Wade. Then, you're going to have what they're talking about now, the gun expansion, more Second Amendment right kind of stuff. Now, as a matter of disclosure, I'm for guns. I personally think the Gun Control Act of 68, 69 was an unconstitutional law to begin with, and that people have a right to guns. Before 1968, you could get out of prison and go buy a gun legally the next day.
Yeah, right? Walk out of your prison cell and go to the gun store.
Go buy a gun. Nobody questions.
No problem.
So I'm for guns. Primarily, I'm for guns because if everybody in this country owns a ton of guns, well, there's not a nation on this earth that will do a ground assault in the United States, because everybody perceives that every household has 417 guns or whatever.
They have a few, yeah. It's more
That's
like
the
an arsenal.
You know, but one of the next things that would happen after the guns, what I think is going to happen next would be prayer going back into school. Those were the two hot buttons in the 70s. In the 60s, you got the Gun Control Act. Though, if they do away with that, to where everybody can have a gun, even felons, then the Supreme Court would be, and the right wing is going to be happy with that. The nationalists are going to be happy with that. If you do away with abortion, do away with, or you give prayer back into school, Christians are going to love that. And Christian base, of course, is the base of the Republican Party. The religious right fuels the political right. Without the religious right, the political right is going to collapse and fall. So you got to make the white evangelicals happy. So then prayer comes back into school. So the next issue is going to be gay rights. You take away gay rights. So now you make gay marriages illegal again. You bring back the sodomy laws and that kind of stuff. So you start getting rid of civil rights one by one. But what the movement does not understand, has never understood, is sort of the settled ground that the Christian right wants is to go back to the 1950s. Where the dad earned the living, mom stayed at home, raised
Leave it to Beaver.
Leave it to Beaver.
Father knows best.
Right. That's, to them, that was heaven. That's the heaven they understood.
Right. That was the golden age. We're going to make America great again.
Yeah.
Where have I heard that before?
By going back to 1950. The problem with 1950, women had no rights.
Yeah.
You couldn't get a credit card in 1950.
Yeah, it's segregation. As on the books as law. Yeah. If you were African American in the 50s, you were not happy in the South for sure, or anywhere else for that matter.
You were hung.
Yeah, you were literally lynched.
In the South, you could. There were still lynchings in the 60s. In the South.
Yeah.
You're doing away with stuff. And if you even, for a lot of them that want to go back to 1776. Who had rights in 1776?
Exactly.
White men. That was it.
Yeah, we had slaves then.
Yeah, that's what in their minds, they have romanticized the 1950s. They romanticized 1776. They don't understand the struggles that the founding fathers went through, the doubts. How do we honestly form this country to reach some ideal of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody? How is that even possible? And what the right wants to do is do away with that whole conflict that the founding fathers were going through and just go back to the fact that white men had control, nobody else did, because they're afraid. They're afraid that the white race is going to be done away with and white men are no longer going to have control.
No.
That's the fear in the movement.
It comes around full circle because you had this kid, again, as we're doing this recording, wasn't that long ago, up in Buffalo, New York. He's an 18-year-old kid. He gets into this conspiracy theory, the Great Replacement Theory, which has roots in your CSA stuff and all that going way back. Sure. And he feels like he's got to act out. He posts a 180-page manifesto on 4chan. He gets a bunch of guns and he drives, 2 hours or whatever he did to Buffalo and kills a bunch of African Americans because he's heard all this stuff from the likes of Tucker Carlson and people like him. And that's, where you've crossed the line.
Never stops to think, how will this act change what's going on in this country?
Yeah. How's it going to stop them from replacing us, quote unquote? But yeah, the guys in Charlottesville, just a number of years ago, they were chanting, Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us. So again, you've got that thread running through all this stuff, don't you?
I can remember at CSA, we would talk about what would ever happen if we had a black president in this country. And of course, the fear was that black president would bring forth some sort of a martial law and start putting whites in prisons or concentration camps.
Yeah.
And do to them what had been done to the black.
Flip the tables and
turn the tables around. That was the biggest fear, right? Which of course would never happen. Obama had no thinking in those terms, right?
Yeah.
So it was interesting. After, of course, CSA was a Republican Party. People, I was raised Democrat before I moved up there, and I was still Democrat before I moved up there. I wasn't Republican until Reagan. I voted. First time I could vote, I voted for Jimmy Carter.
Oh yeah, he was an evangelical.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of stuff happened in the country, and I ended up voting for Reagan. Voted Republican after that. I was still voting Republican when I got out of prison, and still, I got my voting rights back. Still voting Republican. When John McCain ran, I was going to vote for John McCain, especially the early talk was he was going to have Joe Lieberman as his VP. I love Joe Lieberman. I really liked McCain. So to me, that was
a win-win.
Yeah.
Then along came Sarah Palin.
And I said, there ain't a way in the world.
No chance.
God, could you imagine something happened to McCain and she gets beat president?
My God, that's horrific.
I
can't even imagine that.
So then I heard Obama talking, and I had never even considered voting for Obama, but I heard him talking. He said something to the effect of, as president, I would try my best to open up a dialogue and talk to terrorists to see how we can come to some sort of a compromise or something. I want to understand their point of view. That immediately impressed me, because I felt like that was what Danny Colson was saying to me during the siege of CSA. Is we're not here to hurt you. We want to understand you. And one thing he said to me was, you'd be surprised at how much of similar ideology that most of the people in the FBI have with y'all, So but when Obama said that struck me. So I decided to look at Obama. To me, Obama was a good Christian man. He was a great family man, loved his wife, loved his daughters. There was nothing to me wrong with this guy.
Other than the color of his skin.
Other than the color of skin, I didn't have a problem about that point.
Exactly.
So for the first time since Jimmy Carter, I voted Democrat.
Wow.
Because of him. And I can't honestly imagine ever voting Republican again.
Oh man. After Trump.
Well, yeah, after Trump. But here's what the problem is in America today, Clint. We have Obama for 2 terms. Now, the pendulum always swings to the opposite side.
Yes, it does.
So, Trump was the exact opposite of Obama in every possible way.
Yeah, and he hated Obama, too.
Oh, he just hated
to top it off.
Yeah, he was always talking about that, Obama was born in Kenya and all that.
Birtherism,
Birtherism. So it was natural that we'd have to bring in somebody that was the total opposite to Obama when he left. And then, of course, here comes COVID. And so for almost 2 years, people are stuck in their homes. Isolation. I used to believe isolation was the number one good thing about the farm, Arkansas. We were separate from society. I didn't realize till it was all over with, isolation was the number one problem. Because we didn't associate with anybody. We didn't have a balance. We didn't, of course, again, there's no internet. There's no way to, it's just us. The only people we ever talked to were other groups like us.
Right. You're in an echo chamber, literally.
Right. So here's been not even a year since we started coming out of COVID, and we're having all kinds of issues. I don't believe we will see the full effects of the psyche of what it's done to people during COVID, at least for another 10 years. To me, it's inevitable we're going to see more mass shootings, because for a year and a half, up to 2 years, people like what we've seen so far have been stuck surfing the web, and all they listen to is QAnon, Newsmax,
Alex Jones, Fox News.
It's the propaganda. They're hearing the propaganda over and over and over again. It's the cult mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not even touching the surface yet of what that can do to people. What that is doing to people.
What is doing, it's absolutely true. There's a lot to be concerned about. I'm glad there's people like you out there who are speaking the truth to this stuff. I've got one last question now. I keep saying I have one last question, but where can people find you if they want to get a hold of you on social media? What's the best place? I mentioned your Facebook page. Is that the best place to find you?
Right now, it's the only place. Now I'm making plans to start doing podcasts myself.
Oh, right.
Yeah, to try to reach out to people in the movement.
Right.
Because I've got a perspective most don't. There are a lot of people who come out of the movement, but I'm the old man of everybody that's come out. So I've got a more historical aspect, reference, than some of the others do. And I've been out longer than probably anybody else has that's still living today. So I've finally got me a new computer. I've got me a microphone and headphones.
Hey, you're halfway there.
I've been reading up on how to do everything for 3 or 4 years now.
Time to pull the trigger on this thing.
Well, I'm hoping to have everything done by the 1st of July, where I start doing my own, put out my first podcast.
Very good. Well, if I can help you in any way, Kerry, reach out to me. I would love to help you start your podcast. So I went through a long journey of basically just researching myself and figuring out how to do it. So I can share with you anything that might help you. So people can find you on your Facebook page. I think it's called Noble Insights. Isn't that what your Facebook page is? You're not on Twitter or anything else at this point?
I tried Twitter, and my God,
didn't get it.
I did not get it.
Okay. And Facebook is the port of call then for people. Well, I'll put the link in the show notes, and people can find you on your Facebook page. And I know you post up a lot of stuff, so it's quite interesting to read. So thank you so much, Kerry. It's been great, meeting you, chatting with you, getting to know you a little bit. I'm sure we'll stay in touch. And like I said, if you need any help on your podcast, let me know, and I'll be happy to help you.
Thanks, man. I'll pick your brain.